Hi, welcome to today's story. And today's story is a favourite fairy story, a children's story, and it's called The Elves and The Shoemaker. Now remember, keep looking to see if anything in the background has changed. I still think that they're going to change that picture behind me one day. So keep your eyes peeled, see if there's anything different in today's story. Right, see you in a minute. Once upon a time there lived a shoemaker and his wife. The man was a very, very good shoemaker, and he worked very hard as well. Yet, despite all of his efforts, he and his wife were very, very poor. As time went on, they grew poorer and poorer. At last the day came when all the shoemaker had left was one piece of leather. It would only make one pair of shoes. And that evening, before he went to bed, the shoemaker cut out a pair of shoes from the leather, and then he left them on his workbench, all ready for him to sew the very next morning. Now, as they were going upstairs to bed that night, the shoemaker spoke very sadly to his wife. "I've used up my last piece of leather," he said. "I have cut out one pair of shoes. Tomorrow I will sew them, and when they are sold, I do not know what will become of us." The next morning the shoemaker got up early and went into his workshop, ready to make those very shoes. And on his bench, instead of the leather he had left cut out, he found a pair of shoes, already made. He was astonished and did not know what to think. Where had they come from? Did he make these last night? The shoemaker took the shoes in his hands and looked carefully at them. They were very neatly made, with not one bad stitch in them. He showed the shoes to his wife, who said, "I've never seen a pair of shoes so well made. They're perfect." The shoemaker and his wife could not think who had sewn the shoes. The same morning, a lady came into the shop to buy a pair of shoes. The shoemaker showed her the pair that he had found on his bench, and she said, "Oh, I have never seen such well-made shoes." The lady tried on the shoes, and they fitted her perfectly. She was so pleased with them that she paid the shoemaker twice the usual price. With the money, the shoemaker was able to buy leather for 2 more pairs of shoes. That night, before he went to bed, he cut out 2 pairs of shoes from the leather. He left them on his workbench, all ready to sew the next morning. The next morning, the shoemaker got up early and went into his shop to make the shoes. But he had no need to do so. On his bench he found 2 pairs of shoes already made. He took the shoes in his hands and looked so carefully at them. Once more he found that they were very neatly made, with not one bad stitch in them. Well, that morning a man came into the shop to buy some shoes. The shoemaker showed him the 2 pairs of shoes that he had found on his bench. The man said, "Oh, I have never seen such well-made shoes." He was so pleased with them that he bought both pairs of shoes and paid the shoemaker twice the usual price. And so it went on. Every night the shoemaker cut out some leather and left it on his workbench. And every morning he found the shoes all neatly made. Many rich customers came to his shop to buy these perfect shoes, so in time the shoemaker and his wife actually, instead of being very poor, they became very, very rich indeed. One evening, not long before Christmas, when the shoemaker had finished cutting out shoes, he went to his wife. "You know, my dear, we still do not know who sews the shoes for us," he said. "Shall we stay up tonight to see who it is that helps us?" His wife thought that this was a very, very good idea. So she lit a candle and they went into the workshop. They hid themselves very carefully in a corner of the room. And then the shoemaker and his wife waited very, very quietly and watched to see what would happen. For a long time, nothing happened. And then just after the clock struck midnight, the door of the workshop opened quietly. In came two tiny elves. They were dressed in very old clothes and their feet were bare. They did not see the shoemaker and his wife, who were hiding in the corner, watching them ever so carefully and quietly. The elves jumped onto the workbench and took up the shoes that were cut out. They began to stitch and sew and hammer away. They worked so neatly and so quickly that the shoemaker could hardly believe his eyes. The elves did not stop for a single moment until all of the cut-out shoes were finished, and then they quickly ran away. The next morning at breakfast, the shoemaker asked his wife, "How can we thank these little elves who have made us so very rich and so happy?" "I know what we can do," said his wife. "We can make them new clothes and shoes. Their own clothes are very ragged and their feet are bare. Let's do that." During the evenings that followed, the shoemaker and his wife began to make new clothes for the elves. The shoemaker chose the softest leather he could find. He cut out two of the tiniest pairs of shoes ever seen, and then he stitched the shoes as carefully as ever he could. The shoemaker's wife cut out two white shirts, two small green jackets, and two pairs of trousers to match. She sewed them with ever so tiny stitches. She made two little caps, each with a feather in it, and she also knitted two pairs of tiny white stockings. By Christmas Eve, the tiny shoes and clothes were finished. The shoemaker cleared the leather and all of his tools from his workbench. He and his wife carefully laid their presents on the bench instead of the usual work. And then they hid themselves, as they had done before, and waited to see what the elves would do. Just as the clock struck midnight, the door opened ever so quietly as before. The two elves came running in. They still wore old clothes and their feet were blue with cold. They jumped onto the bench, ready to get to work at once. But there was no leather on the bench, only the ever so tiny clothes. The elves were astonished at first, and then they were delighted. In no time at all they were out of their old clothes, and then they dressed themselves in the beautiful new jackets. Green jackets, trousers, white shirts and stockings, the soft leather shoes and little caps with the feathers that nodded as they laughed. And then they joined hands and danced around, singing, "Now we are boys so fine to see, we need no longer cobblers be." And at last they danced happily all the way out of the door. The shoemaker and his wife never saw the little elves again, but from that time good luck was always with them. They were rich and happy for the rest of their lives. Hope you enjoyed the story. See you next time. Bye.